The night is quiet. The world has slowed its breath, and as you close your eyes, allow yourself to drift gently through time far across the seas, to a place where bamboo forests whispered ancient secrets and the cherry blossoms danced like falling snow. This is the land of old Japan, where the soil holds memories of emperors and warriors, poets and peasants. And tonight, in the softness of your rest, you will walk among them. Our journey begins over 1,000 years ago, in the Heian period, a time when beauty and order ruled the court, and Kyoto shimmered like a jewel in the heart of the islands. The emperor, though divine in the eyes of the people, lived in a world of quiet ceremony and hidden sorrow. Draped in robes of flowing silk, he moved through his palace like a shadow of something holy. But his voice was rarely heard. The real power slipped quietly into the hands of noble families, particularly the Fujiwara clan, who ruled with politeness on the surface and quiet manipulation beneath. In this time, the court lived like a dream. Men and women wrote poetry on thin paper scented with incense. They exchanged glances behind silk screens and judged each other by the calligraphy of their letters. Every word mattered. Every movement was art. It was beautiful and suffocating. The emperor, who bore the blood of gods, spent his days in layered silence. Though he was worshipped, he was not free. Outside the palace walls, life moved to a different rhythm. In the fields, peasants bent over rice paddies from dawn to dusk, hands in the wet earth, faces to the sky. Life was hard but grounded. These were the people who fed the empire, yet they lived almost unseen. Between the noble and the farmer stood a rising class, men who would soon reshape Japan. They were warriors. They were the beginning of the samurai. The samurai were not born in castles. They were born on muddy roads, at the edges of towns, in moments of war and need. At first, they were hired swords, protectors of landowners and enforcers of private justice. But something in them hardened with purpose. They began to live by their own code, one formed not in scrolls, but in blood and silence. Honor, loyalty, discipline, these were not ideas. They were survival. As the emperor's voice faded further behind screens of ceremony, the warrior's voice grew stronger. In distant provinces, the samurai began to command loyalty, not just from their lords, but from the people. They were not just fighters. They were symbols of a simpler justice, one carried on the back of a blade. One such man, it is whispered, was born near the coast, his name lost to time. As a boy, he watched his father kneel to a corrupt nobleman, watched his village suffer under unfair taxes. He learned early that power could wear a smile and still crush you. But he also learned how to hold a wooden sword with steady hands, how to watch the wind and know when the rain would fall. These were small things, but they built something quiet and strong inside him. By his 15th year, he had already joined a small militia. They fought not for glory, but to protect their rice stores from raiders. His first kill was accidental, a panicked thrust in the dark. He didn't sleep for days. Yet, with each passing season, he became more still, more precise. His blade did not sing, it whispered, and soon men followed him. The samurai were beginning to shape a new order. They carried their own code, Bushido, though it would not be named until centuries later. They served with complete loyalty to their lords, even when those lords did not deserve it. They trained their minds as well as their bodies, reading poetry, studying tactics, learning restraint. The sword, they said, was not just a weapon. It was the soul of a man. Back in the capital, the emperor aged behind silk curtains, never lifting a sword, never walking beyond the palace gates. His sons were born into the same quiet prison. They wore the symbols of power but commanded none. Meanwhile, the world outside changed shape. Villages turned into strongholds. Clans formed alliances in whispers, broke them in fire. The scent of war traveled on the wind. But tonight, none of that need trouble your sleep. You are walking only as a ghost in this history, unseen, untouched, simply drifting through a time long gone. The moonlight falls softly on the tiled roofs of ancient Kyoto. A wind chime sways gently in the warm summer air. Somewhere, a samurai trains in the courtyard under the stars. Somewhere, a young emperor dreams of freedom. And you, here in the stillness, begin to understand the weight of honor, the beauty of silence, the tragedy of unseen power. The morning mist rolled gently across the hills, soft as breath, weaving between temple roofs and bamboo groves. Birds called lazily in the distance as though waking late from dreams of better days. The capital, Kyoto, stirred slowly. Servants opened wooden doors with quiet hands, and nobles whispered their first greetings of the day, careful not to break the sacred silence. In this world, noise was a kind of violence. Everything was meant to flow like water in a stone basin. But beyond the delicate world of the court, the land was changing. And in the east, where the mountains touched the sky, a different kind of power was waking. The samurai were no longer just swords for hire. They had become the bones of the land's true rule. One family, more than any other, would rise above the rest, the Minamoto clan. Their name was spoken with a mix of fear and awe. For decades, they had fought in the shadows, building influence quietly, biding their time while others boasted and feasted. The Minamoto were patient, and patience in Japan was a kind of blade. It was in this storm of shifting loyalties and hidden wars that a man named Minamoto no Yoritomo rose. Exiled as a boy, watched as his family was slaughtered in a failed uprising, he spent years in silence, studying, training, waiting. His time came when others least expected it. With the support of other samurai clans, especially the cunning Hojo family, he raised a rebellion not just against men, but against the very idea of who should rule. The emperor, still shrouded in ceremony, watched as the war unfolded like a poem too violent to read. Yoritomo's army swept across the land, not with speed, but with certainty. His men did not wear gold. They did not sing before battle. They moved with the cold quiet of winter. And when they arrived, the land bent. When the dust settled, Yoritomo did not destroy the emperor. That would have been too loud, too final. Instead, he bowed, a deep, formal bow, and the emperor, with hands trembling in his sleeves, granted Yoritomo the title of Shogun, Supreme Commander. It was a word that seemed ceremonial, but in truth it was the final breath of imperial power. Yoritomo bowed, yes, but he ruled. The samurai, once shadows in the corners of power, now stood at the center. From his new capital in Kamakura, Yoritomo built a government rooted in loyalty, order, and war readiness. The emperor remained in Kyoto, surrounded by incense and tradition, like a statue in a temple, honored, worshipped, but no longer alive. And with that, the shogunate era began. For the next 7 centuries, Japan would be ruled not by bloodlines of gods, but by blades and codes. Yet even in this time of warriors and conquest, peace found its way into the cracks. Zen Buddhism spread like wind over a quiet pond, touching the hearts of many samurai. They sat in stillness beneath falling leaves, breathing deeply, letting go of desire. They found in simplicity a kind of strength, one not built with armor, but with breath. In mountain temples carved from stone, monks taught the way of nothingness, that in emptiness one could find clarity, that death was not to be feared but accepted, like the fall of a cherry blossom. Some samurai, after years of battle, laid down their swords and entered monasteries. Others carried Zen into their fighting, cutting not with rage, but with stillness. It was during these years that the katana, curved, elegant, precise, became the soul of the samurai. Forged in fire, folded again and again, it was more than a weapon. It was a mirror, and the one who held it was expected to be as clean, as balanced, as beautiful in action as the blade itself. But not all followed the code. In the shadows of castles and rice fields, betrayals festered. Brothers killed brothers for honor. Lords demanded seppuku, ritual suicide, for failure as minor as a delay in orders. Villages were burned for suspicion, and all the while the emperor remained, a pale figure behind a screen, writing poetry by moonlight while war thundered just beyond the city walls. There's something sad in that image. A man crowned by heaven, destined to be worshipped, yet stripped of all true voice. He was both everything and nothing, a god among ghosts. Still, he endured. The emperors of Japan would continue to exist, even as warlords ruled and blood soaked the soil. Their presence, though powerless, reminded the people that somewhere in the heavens, balance still mattered. And so the centuries turned. The sound of swords echoed in narrow valleys. Scrolls were burned and rewritten. Children were born into duty. And in the stillness of temples and the silence of death, the soul of Japan deepened. Tonight, as you sleep, imagine that you are walking through a stone courtyard at dawn. A light wind brushes your face. Somewhere nearby, a monk rings a bell. A samurai passes you in silence, his blade sheathed, his eyes calm. And far off, beneath cherry blossoms that have not yet bloomed, an emperor dreams. The rain had come during the night, soft and steady, washing the dust from tiled rooftops and feeding the thirsty earth. By morning, the sky above Kamakura was pale and heavy with mist, and the streets smelled of wet stone and cedar wood. The city, once a quiet coastal town, had grown into the seat of power, shaped by the will of warriors. This was no court of silk and poetry. This was a place of armor, oaths, and law, carved into the bones of the land. Minamoto no Yoritomo had long passed. His body returned to the soil he once ruled, but the shogunate he founded endured. His successors tried to hold the reins of power with the same iron calm, but the world refused to stay still. No sooner had one clan risen than another would challenge it, testing the strength of alliances, pushing at the walls of peace. As the centuries turned, power shifted again, not from samurai to emperors, but from shoguns to shadows. The Hojo family, once loyal to Yoritomo, now pulled the strings of government from behind a curtain of polite silence. The shoguns became figureheads themselves, much like the emperors they had once overshadowed. And in that space of quiet control, distrust began to bloom. Villages across Japan learned to survive not on loyalty, but on fear. Peasants worked their rice fields under the watch of armored men who demanded more than taxes. They demanded obedience. Samurai, who had once protected the weak, now served masters obsessed with dominance. The code of Bushido, once a sacred path, was twisted to justify cruelty. Still, not all warriors fell to corruption. Some lived with quiet dignity, teaching their sons to serve with honor, their daughters to live with grace. Among these was a ronin, a samurai without a master, who walked alone through the provinces, known only by the sound of his straw sandals and the strange softness in his eyes. He was neither rich nor famous. He carried no banner, bore no surname that others feared. But his blade, they said, never missed. And when he struck, it was not with rage, but with sorrow. He had once served a lord in the northern mountains, a man wise and just. But the lord had defied a powerful clan and was crushed, his castle burned, his retainers executed. The ronin had escaped only because he had been sent away on an errand of loyalty. He returned to smoke and silence. Since then he had wandered, not to avenge, but to remember. Each village he passed, he helped where he could. A thief here, a corrupt taxman there. He did not seek thanks, only balance. Stories of such men traveled faster than truth. People whispered his deeds by firelight, and some even claimed he was the ghost of a fallen warrior, doomed to walk until justice ruled again. But he was no ghost, only a man bound by a promise, carrying a blade he no longer wished to use. Meanwhile, the emperor, now merely a spiritual presence, watched the land he once ruled drift further into the hands of warlords. In Kyoto, ceremonies still took place. Lanterns were still lit for festivals. Poems were still written. But the real pulse of Japan beat in distant provinces, where steel clashed and alliances shifted like sand. Then came the Mongols. In the 13th century, the sea brought more than salt and fish. It brought fear. From the west came stories of horsemen with eyes like fire, of cities burned to ash, of empires kneeling before them. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, sent word to the shogunate, a demand for submission. It was not a request. It was a warning. The response from Japan was silence. Twice the Mongols came, first in 1274, and then again in 1281. Their fleets darkened the horizon. Soldiers from across Asia filled their ships. The samurai, more used to personal duels than massive battles, were caught unprepared. The first invasion brought chaos and destruction. But then, just as it seemed Japan would fall, a typhoon rose from the sea, tearing the Mongol ships apart, dragging them into the depths. The second invasion met a similar fate. Again, the wind came. Again, the sea defended Japan. They called it kamikaze, divine wind. The people believed the gods had protected them. But the truth was not so simple. The battles left scars. Fortifications were built. Fear lingered in the hearts of the leaders. And though the Mongols never returned, their shadow never truly left. The ronin, now older, witnessed these storms from a distant hilltop. He did not cheer. He did not pray. He simply watched and then turned away. He understood that even divine winds come at a cost. The land was not saved by gods alone. It was saved by men who died unnamed, by those who fought not for glory, but because they must. And now, as you lie still, the rain outside slows to a gentle drip. The night holds your breath like a secret, and somewhere in a time long past, a lone samurai sharpens his blade by candlelight, not for war, but to honor a silence that only he understands. The air over Kyoto had grown heavier with time, though the city still wore its beauty like a delicate kimono. Temples rising against the hills, plum trees blooming in the spring. Something had changed beneath its surface. The rituals continued, the incense burned, the poems were read beneath paper lanterns. But power no longer rested here. It had drifted far from the throne, carried by blood and ambition to other hands. The emperor remained dignified and distant, but each bow to him became more habit than reverence. He was now less ruler and more symbol, like the rising sun sewn onto the banners of samurai, present but untouchable. The Kamakura shogunate that had once ruled with iron clarity had begun to crumble under its own weight. After the Mongol invasions, the cost of defense had drained the treasury. The warriors who had protected the islands expected reward, but there was little left to give. Promises were broken. Trust, once held together by loyalty and pride, began to rot in the dark corners of ambition. Out of this decay rose new clans, hungry for control, sharp with strategy. Among them were the Ashikaga, distant relatives of the imperial family, yet fierce enough to bite at the shogunate's heels. When Kamakura fell, it did not fall like a tree in a storm, nor when it rotted slowly and then snapped under the pressure of internal betrayal. By the 14th century, a new shogunate emerged, led by Ashikaga Takauji. He claimed to serve the emperor, but in truth, he served his own blade. And, for a time, it seemed as though Japan would know stability again. But history, especially in this land, does not unfold in peace for long. Soon the nation would plunge into one of its darkest and most chaotic eras. Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. There were no longer clear rulers. The emperor remained in Kyoto, a puppet of whichever lord controlled the court. The Ashikaga shoguns ruled in name, but their influence weakened with each passing year. Across the provinces, powerful daimyos, feudal lords, carved the country into fragments. Alliances formed in the morning and shattered by nightfall. Castles were built, burned, and built again. Samurai fought not for honor alone, but for the land, for survival, for legacy. This was a time of endless conflict, but it was also a time when legends were born. Among the mist and steel of the Sengoku era walked a man named Oda Nobunaga. Brilliant, ruthless, and feared, he rose from a minor lord to one of the most terrifying and effective military leaders Japan had ever seen. He broke the traditions that bound others. Where old samurai prized ceremony, he valued speed. Where they clung to loyalty, he inspired fear. His armies moved like smoke, striking hard and disappearing before his enemies could react. Nobunaga challenged the entire structure of Japanese power. He destroyed monasteries that acted like armed kingdoms. He welcomed Western weapons, firearms brought by Portuguese traders, and used them without hesitation. He did not bow to the past, he erased it. But even a storm must meet silence. One of his trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, betrayed him. In the temple of Honnoji, surrounded and caught unaware, Nobunaga chose to end his own life, a warrior's death. His dreams of unifying Japan were buried in ash, but his ambition did not die. It passed to another man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant, a man who should never have been more than a servant. Yet through cunning, skill, and unshakable will, he rose to become the second great unifier of Japan. Hideyoshi continued what Nobunaga began. He brought peace by forcing the lords into submission. He built castles that stretched into the clouds, enforced land surveys, and demanded that only samurai could carry swords. He froze the class system. The son of a farmer would remain a farmer. The son of a warrior would train with blade and bow. It was control through order. But Hideyoshi, too, had his flaws. In his later years, pride poisoned him. He dreamed of conquering Korea and even China. He launched invasions that bled his people, and achieved nothing but exhaustion. When he died, he left behind a fragile alliance and a young son too weak to hold it. And so, once again, the land began to fracture. But for now, as your breath softens, imagine the quiet before the next storm. The sun rises slowly over a battlefield that has not yet known blood. In the shadow of a great castle, soldiers stir. A daimyo stands at the edge of his garden, sipping tea, watching cherry blossoms fall. Somewhere, a child is born, one who will change everything. The earth does not rush, it remembers. The wind had shifted again, not just in the air, but in the soul of the country. The fields that once echoed with the clash of swords had begun to quiet. The rivers, swollen with the reflections of burning castles, now carried the silence of what remained. The Sengoku era, drenched in betrayal and ambition, was slowly yielding to something else. A final chapter of unification, written by the most patient warrior of them all, from the shadows left by Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rose a man of measured words and deadly intent, Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was not born of fire like Nobunaga, nor did he charm his way to power. Like Hideyoshi, he waited, observed, calculated. For decades he served loyally under stronger men, hiding the sharpness of his ambition behind folded hands and lowered eyes. But inside he was stone. When Hideyoshi died, he left behind a young son and a council of regents to guide him. Tokugawa was one of them, and as the other lords bickered and postured, Ieyasu gathered strength. He knew that loyalty could be borrowed and broken, that armies did not follow ideals, they followed certainty, and in time all roads bent toward him. The final blow came at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. It was the clash that would decide the fate of Japan. Two great coalitions faced off, East versus West, order versus chaos. Ieyasu led his men not with loud speeches, but with the unshakable calm of a man who already saw the ending. When betrayal split the opposing forces from within, he crushed them with ruthless precision, and with that, the land fell still. 3 years later, the emperor, still a ceremonial figure, granted Ieyasu the title of shogun, but this time the meaning was clear. This was not temporary rule. This was legacy. Thus began the Tokugawa shogunate, a dynasty that would hold power for over 250 years. Under Tokugawa rule, Japan transformed. It was not a time of war, but of walls. The country was sealed from the outside world, foreigners expelled, Christianity banned, and trade restricted to carefully controlled ports. This isolation, known as Sakoku, lasted for more than 2 centuries. Japan turned inward, protecting itself not with swords, but with silence. The samurai, once fierce warriors of blood and loyalty, became bureaucrats, scholars, enforcers of peace rather than war. Their swords remained polished and revered, but rarely drawn. Many turned to poetry, philosophy, and the slow art of tea. They were symbols of discipline and tradition, but their time of battle had passed. In the towns and cities, a new class began to rise, the merchant. Though low in status, they grew rich, quietly shaping the economy, while the samurai clung to an honor that no longer paid. The balance of power shifted again, not by force, but by change. In Kyoto, the emperor remained, a silent witness to centuries of upheaval. And though his court was quiet, the poetry never stopped. Generations of writers, monks, and forgotten princesses scribbled verses on rice paper, dreaming of the days when their words held power. They knew their role was no longer to rule, but to remember. In one quiet district, an old Ronin, his hair now white, opened a small school for children. He taught them not to fight, but to think, to hold a brush with the same care once given to a sword. He spoke of war not as glory, but as burden. And when the cherry blossoms fell each year, he would sit beneath them in silence, remembering the friends he had buried and the lords he had served. He knew that peace had a cost, but it was a cost worth paying. The Tokugawa era brought stability, yes, but it also brought stillness that hardened into something brittle. No change, no innovation, no outside voices. A nation preserved in its own reflection. Yet, even in this stillness, beauty thrived. Art flourished. The ukiyo-e painters captured fleeting moments of pleasure and sorrow. Haiku poets distilled the world into 17 syllables. And in the countryside, the seasons continued to change, indifferent to the schemes of men. Tonight, as you lie beneath your own roof, far from those distant shores, imagine the narrow streets of Edo, now Tokyo, lit by lanterns, quiet with curfews. Safe beneath that iron grip of order, hear the clink of a tea bowl, the soft sweep of a broom, the slow steps of a patrol. This was a land that had seen gods and warriors, emperors and rebels, and now it dreamed of peace. Time, even when it moves slowly, never stops. Beneath the surface of Tokugawa Japan's peaceful exterior, change was stirring. Though the cities were calm and the provinces quiet, a restless current moved beneath the silence. The samurai walked the streets with polished swords, but empty hands. Their battles were no longer fought with steel, but with paper, policy, and ceremony. For many, the code of Bushido had become a ghost, a memory honored but rarely lived. In Edo, the capital of the shogunate, life followed a rigid rhythm. Curfews were enforced. Movement was watched. Foreign influence was forbidden. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shoguns ruled with a grip that tightened not with blood, but with regulation. The streets were orderly. The people knew their place. Merchants grew rich, yet could not claim honor. Peasants toiled with little chance of rising. The samurai, once warriors of the wind and field, now read ledgers and resolved village disputes. But beyond the shores of Japan, the world was changing. Empires in the West expanded across oceans, fueled by industrial hunger and imperial greed. Steamships now crossed the seas faster than ever before, carrying not just goods, but ideas. And in the minds of those few Japanese who still remembered the world beyond their islands, a question began to form. How long could the gates remain closed? Then, in the year 1853, the silence shattered. 4 black ships appeared on the horizon of Edo Bay. Their smokestacks belched fire and steam, and their hulls, coated in dark paint, seemed to blot out the sky. They were American warships led by Commodore Matthew Perry. Their cannons faced the city, and with them came a simple demand. Open your ports, or face the consequences. The Tokugawa government, unprepared and outmatched, hesitated. Their isolation had kept them safe for centuries, but now it left them blind. The Americans did not speak in poetry. They did not bow before old gods. They spoke of treaties, trade, and the might of industry. Their weapons were not swords, but steel machines that could destroy in moments what had taken lifetimes to build. With trembling hands, the shogunate agreed. In 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening its doors for the first time in over 200 years. Other Western nations followed. And with them came merchants, missionaries, diplomats, and spies. The black ships had done more than break the barrier. They had cracked the foundation. Inside the country, fear turned to anger. The people began to question the shogunate's strength. Samurai loyal to the old ways whispered of betrayal. Ronin wandered again, not in quiet reflection, but in search of purpose. And deep within the imperial court in Kyoto, a movement began to stir, one that called for the return of true power to the emperor. The shogunate, weakened by indecision and internal decay, could not hold back the tide. Rebellions flared. Young lords and passionate warriors took up a new cause. Sano Joy revered the emperor, expelled the barbarians. The balance of power shifted once again, not with a single blow, but with the slow erosion of belief. In 1868, after centuries of silence and ceremony, the emperor rose. His name was Meiji. He was young, quiet, and watched carefully by those who sought to use him. But he represented something ancient and powerful, a divine right long forgotten. And when the Tokugawa shogun resigned, the world changed in a single breath. The Meiji Restoration had begun. The emperor moved his seat to Edo, renaming it Tokyo, Eastern Capital. The samurai class was dissolved. Their stipends vanished. Their swords were banned from public display. For many, it was the death of the old world. Honor, tradition, and the warrior spirit were replaced with railroads, factories, and Western suits. Some samurai embraced the change. They saw a future shaped by progress, where Japan could match the West and protect itself through strength and adaptation. Others resisted. They clung to the past, to the blade, to the code. And in 1877, they made their final stand. It was called the Satsuma Rebellion. Thousands of former samurai, led by Saigo Takamori, a man once loyal to the Meiji Emperor, rose against the new government. They fought not for victory, but for remembrance. They knew they would lose. They knew their way of life was ending, but they chose to meet death on their own terms. The final battle came at Shiroyama. Surrounded and outgunned, Saigo and his men faced a modern army equipped with rifles, cannons, and resolve. When the smoke cleared, the samurai lay silent, their spirits absorbed into the land they had sworn to protect. And just like that, an age ended. Now, as your eyes grow heavier, imagine a quiet hill overlooking a peaceful village. The wind carries the scent of pine and riverstone. An old sword rests beneath the floorboards of a forgotten house. A child plays in the field, unaware of the blood that once soaked the soil. The past, now distant, breathes only in dreams and stories. The hills of Japan stood quiet, as if finally allowed to rest. The age of samurai, once thunderous with hooves, steel, and the weight of unbreakable oaths, had slipped into the folds of history. In its place rose something unfamiliar, a modern nation, hurried and loud, pulled by the gravity of the industry and invention. Where once a warrior's silence had meant discipline, now it was drowned beneath train whistles, factory bells, and the murmurs of crowded city streets. The Meiji era swept across the land like fire through dry grass. In just a few short decades, Japan transformed. The emperor, once a shadow behind silk curtains, now became the symbol of forward motion. He wore Western suits and rode in steam trains. Ministers traveled to Europe and America, returning with blueprints, not just for machines, but for society itself. Schools were built, roads carved through old forests. Steel replaced bamboo, and stone replaced wood. For many, it was exciting. For others, disorienting. For the former samurai, it was heartbreaking. Stripped of their titles and privileges, some adapted, becoming teachers, writers, or minor bureaucrats in the new system. Others faded into poverty and obscurity, their swords rusting in quiet corners, their names forgotten. A few clung to the last pieces of their dignity by writing memoirs, recording the fall of their way of life, as if to preserve it for a world that no longer asked for it. Among these was a middle-aged man named Kento, once a retainer to a small daimyo in the north. He had survived the wars, the collapse of his clan, and the sudden rush of progress that followed. Now he lived in a modest wooden house on the edge of Tokyo, surrounded by children he barely understood, and grandchildren who only knew of samurai through books and classroom lessons. He kept his katana wrapped in silk, hidden beneath his bed. He never unsheathed it, not even when drunken men from the neighborhood mocked his stiff walk or his refusal to speak with casual slang. He simply stared at them and walked on. He wasn't afraid. He just understood how useless the blade had become in a world of telegraphs and policemen. In the evenings, Kento would sit by the window and write. Not poetry, not records of war, but memories. Small things. The way his master held a fan during summer heat. The quiet way men bowed to one another before a duel. The crackle of pine in a winter hearth inside a war camp. He wrote not to be remembered, but because he feared the silence that would come if no one did. As Tokyo grew taller and louder, the past began to fade from its bones. Shrines were moved to make space for railroads. Old castles turned into schools or museums. Children laughed at stories of samurai ghosts. Progress did not pause to grieve. And yet, in the countryside, in small villages tucked between mountains and rivers, the old ways whispered still. A farmer bowed before entering a shrine. A mother told her child to walk with respect, even on a dirt road. An elderly woman kept a black and white photograph of her husband, once a samurai guard beside a vase of incense sticks. The world changed, but the land remembered. Then came war. The new Japan, strong and ambitious, no longer feared the West. It began to look outward with the same hunger once shown by those who had arrived on black ships. Japan invaded Korea, clashed with China, and stunned the world by defeating Russia in 1905. The nation was reborn not as a peaceful garden of tradition, but as a rising empire of might. Many saw this as vengeance for humiliation, a reclaiming of pride. Others felt uneasy. They saw the past repeating, not in the form of samurai honor, but as nationalism wrapped in new armor. The sword had returned, but it no longer followed a code. It followed orders. Kento did not live to see this. He passed away quietly one spring morning, sitting beneath the cherry tree he had planted as a young man. His katana remained wrapped, untouched. His family buried him with the same respect his father had received, even if the rituals were no longer widely practiced. In the silence of his passing, something settled, a small, final bow to an era that had ended long ago. But as the cherry blossoms drifted across his grave, one landed on the silk-wrapped hilt of his sword. A breeze lifted it, then carried it into the sky. Because history never truly ends. It breathes in quiet places, waiting for someone to listen. Spring returned to the land with soft footsteps. The rivers ran clearer, the plum trees bloomed once again, and life, no matter how modern, how fast, paused for a moment under the gentle weight of cherry blossoms. In the cities, trains rumbled, factories roared, and crowds moved like flowing water. But in the quiet spaces between the noise, the past lingered, not loudly, but patiently, like an old friend watching from a distance. Decades had passed since the last true samurai walked the earth, and yet their shadows remained, etched into the soul of the country, folded into the traditions that refused to die. Tea was still poured with care. The bow, once a gesture between warriors, was now exchanged between shopkeepers and students. In these small movements, the old world lived on. The 20th century brought storms the samurai had never imagined. Japan, now a global power, walked a path far from its old soul. Industry grew, cities swelled, and with it came wars greater than any fought with swords. World War II changed everything. The country, once proud of its isolation, now spread its influence across Asia with force. The warrior spirit was invoked again, not by samurai but by generals and propaganda. Young men, barely trained, were sent to fight in jungles and oceans under the banner of empire. The code of Bushido was twisted into something dark, used not to teach restraint and dignity, but to demand blind sacrifice. Some believed, others obeyed out of fear, and in the chaos, Japan lost more than a war. It lost its reflection. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the land held its breath. In those moments of fire and ash, the past, the centuries of honor, war, peace, and poetry, felt distant, almost unreachable. The emperor, who once ruled unseen behind palace walls, stepped forward to speak for the first time ever on radio. His voice was calm, weary, and final. Japan would surrender. The samurai spirit, once corrupted by ambition, once revived by hope, was now buried beneath rubble and silence. But not forever. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt, not just its cities, but its soul. It did not return to swords and banners. It moved forward, slowly and with care. The post-war generations grew up in a nation that embraced peace, technology, and learning. Yet, even as skyscrapers rose and neon signs lit the night, the old spirit whispered still. In Kyoto, ancient temples were cleaned and preserved. In quiet neighborhoods, elders still taught grandchildren the meaning of respect, discipline, and effort. In martial arts dojos, young boys and girls bowed before wooden floors, learning not how to fight, but how to carry themselves with purpose. The katana, once a tool of war, became an object of reverence, a piece of history, handled with care, displayed not as a weapon, but as a symbol. And in the stories, the samurai never truly died. Movies, novels, and songs kept their memory alive, their courage, their flaws, their tragedies, retold again and again. Children who had never seen a sword still knew names like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu. They dressed as samurai in school plays, wrote essays about Bushido, and whispered to one another about ghost warriors who walked the bamboo forest under full moons. Back in a small town near the coast, an old tea house remained. It had survived storms, war, and time. Inside, a wooden beam hung low, carved long ago with the name of a forgotten clan. Tourists came, drank matcha, and took pictures. But the owner, a gentleman in his 80s, remembered more. He was the great-grandson of a samurai who had served in the north, and sometimes, after closing, he would sit alone and read from a journal passed down through generations, a record of battles, of honor, of regret. He read it not to relive the past, but to remember what mattered. Not war, not pride, but the quiet choices between. Tonight, as the world quiets around you, close your eyes and drift back one last time. Walk the stone paths of Kyoto. Listen to the wind brush against temple walls. Hear the soft rustle of a silk kimono. Somewhere in that dreamscape, a lone samurai walks beneath the blossoms, his sword sheathed, his heart calm. He is not seeking battle, he is only walking home. And in that, there is peace. The end.